So, hey guys, we're back for another podcast interview, and today we have Erik J. Wright. If you don't know who Erik J. Wright is, by the end of this interview, you're going to know everything you need to know, and you're going to rush to Amazon, and you're going to buy all his books because you're going to love them as much as I do. Of course, I want to thank my friends over at the Tombstone Epitaph, Arizona's longest running newspaper. You can get a hold of them and subscribe by going to tombstoneepitaph.com. I urge everybody to do the 3-year for $60 because honestly, if you do 1 year at $25, by the time you get to 3 years, you're going to pay $75. But if you pay the 3-year up front, you save $15. And that's huge. Today, $15, that's lunch, that's dinner with the family and friends. And so you want to save that money by going to tombstoneepitaph.com and subscribe to do the 3-year subscription to get Wild West history in print, in a newspaper, delivered to your door, and get to hold it in your hands, just like Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, all the people, Johnny Ringo, all the people in Tombstone got to hold the epitaph. You'll get the epitaph too by going to tombstoneepitaph.com. I also want to thank my friends over at the Wild West History Association. You can become a member at going to wildwesthistory.org. That's wildwesthistory.org. And you become a member, you get the roundup, and you get all the journal, 100 plus pages, 105 pages of solid Western history. True Provenance is fantastic. But the big thing is you get to be able to connect with people like Erik and John Bosnecker and Marshall Trimble and all the people out there researching history and bringing it right to your door. You can do so. You can actually get out and connect with them like I have by joining and becoming a member of the Wild West History Association by going to wildwesthistory.org. We're also going to be talking a little bit today about the True West magazine and Bob Bose Bell. Bob is I've never met him, but he's a friend of mine, and he helps me out in my quest to bring you these podcasts. And you can find, and Erik, he's also works for True West magazine. You can find subscriptions or become a maniac like I am at truewestmagazine.com. So Erik is somebody that's been passing by my door, my history door, for quite a while. He's been passing by yours. You may not know it. If you're in True West Magazine, if you're in Wild West History Association, if you get the epitaph already, you're finding out about his books and what he's got going on and the things he's doing. And he's got some fantastic books that we're going to talk about. And he's just out there. He's getting it done. And he's a super great dad, and he's got a cool family going on. And we're going to talk about where he lives and his upbringing. So welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So you've been around a little bit. Your articles you can find in True West Magazine and in the Epitaph. And before we get going deep into this, were you born and raised? You mentioned one time in an article about the influence of your parents, that your parents were really involved in Western history, and they were really like the gateway to 19th century history. Talk a little bit about were born and raised and your influences and your folks.
Yeah, so, excuse me, I was born in Tucson, Arizona.
Ooh.
My dad had been more or less raised in Arizona and Tucson and some in Phoenix. He was Oklahoman by birth. My mom was from Phoenix, and they met in Tucson, and that's where they had me. When I was quite young, my parents took a business opportunity in Texas near Fort Worth and moved me and us out there, and that's where I was raised. It's not little anymore, but it was at the time a town called Weatherford, which is famous for, it's got some Lonesome Dove history, some Texas Ranger history. And when I was, getting college age, I moved back to Tucson, where I have an uncle who lives there. It's my father's brother, and went to college there in Tucson, and and that's where I met my wife. So I've always felt home there in southern Arizona, even though I wasn't necessarily raised there. I've spent a lot of my formative years there. But to your question of, I guess, what kind of got me into history. I hear a lot of folks say, "Oh, it was this or it was that." Especially a lot of the older historians. It was some of the old TV shows that got them into that. I'm not from that generation, and I don't mean to belittle those shows in any ways, but I never got into those shows. I think it was just a kind of a tapestry of different things. I remember very distinctly, kind of sneaking off and laying with my dad, and this has been the early 90s, and reading Bob Bell's illustrated Life and Times books of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. And at the time, I was a kid, 10, 11 years old maybe, and not really having a lot of contextual understanding of what I was looking at. My dad was into it, but not to the degree at which he did anything with it besides just read about it. But just kind of being subjected to the pictures and stuff. And my dad was really into other things, like the history of T.E. Lawrence. And I remember having to watch, not like being forced to, but every evening we would watch a Sherlock Holmes show, the old Jeremy Brett series. So kind of just being immersed in kind of this historical kind of atmosphere. As a kid, like any other boy, I guess, I used to play gunfighter. I had a whole arsenal of toy guns. And I was really into Davy Crockett as a kid. So I guess in a way, me and Paul Hutton are alike in that sense. Mm-hmm. I look back and kind of reflect on that question a lot of, was there a singular moment or one thing that got me into it? I don't think so. I think it was just a lot of things kind of coming together at once that kind of made me think, hey, history is kind of interesting, and it's all around me, and I just kind of grew up with it.
I'm kind of in the same boat you are. The early shows, even though I'm a boomer, I'll be 59 this year, and growing up in the 60s and 70s, for me it was Gunsmoke and Ponderosa. That was like my big thing. Ponderosa was like, holy cow, Little Joe and Pa and Dan Blocker and all these people. For me, it was a Ponderosa, but, I didn't really have the stuff like they did, like Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp was before my time. Your parents, though, growing up in Arizona, did they take you down to Tombstone? Or like you said, or were you quickly, maybe 1 or 2 years old, and then you ended up in Texas?
I think prior to our move to Texas, I'm sure my parents probably took us around. I know we had some property up near Show Low. I don't have much memory of that. We moved to Texas right before I started kindergarten. Oh, so that gives you perspective of my age from, once I was born. I was born in 84, and we moved to Texas, I believe, in January of 90. So there wasn't a lot of time there. I think we probably visited Tombstone once because I remember getting like a toy gun set. And that may be something I'm making up in my mind, but it's just something that's kind of stuck there. But it was probably in the mid-90s, and probably because my dad saw the movie Tombstone that got him interested, that got me interested. But you have to understand, too, my dad spent a lot of time in the Rocky Mountain West in the 70s doing like geophysical surveys and stuff like that. And so he got to see a
Cool
lot
stuff.
of what the West was before it was developed by, mining and things like this. So he's always had a passion for the wilderness. And I think that was passed on to me. I ended up doing the same kind of work there during college. Excuse me. But once we lived in Texas and were established there, and then my parents sensed that, hey, our son is developing this interest, especially in Tombstone, they were very quick to nurture whatever interest I had, and they were always very good about taking me to museums. And anyone familiar with Fort Worth knows that Fort Worth has really great museums. I have very distinct memories of going to the museums of Fort Worth frequently. But there were several times we went to Tombstone when I was, I don't know, 7th or 8th grade, maybe 9th grade. And that's where I first met Ben Trawick. It's just in my mind, I was just a naive, dumb kid. And my dad, being what any good father would be, as an advocate and promoter of his child, just kind of drugged me into his office, which anybody that's ever been in Ben Trawick's office knows it's more of a museum and less of an office. Mm-hmm. It was just floor to ceiling stuff. And at the time I didn't know who Ben Trawick was. And it was that first conversation with who I saw as just an old man writing. And he said, "Oh, you got an interest. You live near Dallas Fort Worth. Why don't you, pursue something Tombstone related in the Dallas Fort Worth area?" I thought, well, that doesn't make sense because I don't know what that would be. Mm-hmm. And he kind of gave me a little hint about, Doc Holliday, had spent some time briefly in Dallas. And so that kind of set me and my father on a path for when we got home to do some research, and which turned out into my first article, which is not very good at all by my standards today. I was, I think at that time, 16 when it was published. And it's been writing ever since.
So let's talk about the writing for folks that don't know. Erik has some books out, quite a few books. We're going to mention them here, and they are available on Amazon, and you can get them if you become a subscriber to the Epitaph. On the very back page, there is a spot there where there's a coupon that you can fill out, and you can mail it in with all the books that you want to order, and he'll ship them to your door. Now, here's a list of some of the books that he has. In fact, all of them, unless he corrects me and he says, "Mike, you're full of crap." There's more. There's more in the Wright library. He has Sickness of the Heart, West of Hell, Bad Men of the Old West, Bad Men of the Old West, Policing the Underworld, which I want to talk about that one. That's a little bit of a break from the Old West. Phil Foote, Lawman, Outlaw, and Hellraiser, Main Street Mayhem. You have Boland Isom Families in Europe and America, Gamblers, Guns, and Gavels. Now that one intrigues me because I got to get that one because Peter Brand and Casey Teferchill are involved in it. And I've had both of them interviews, and they're fabulous. They're phenomenal people. Burnt Powder and Rough Justice. Do we have anything else? I think that's it, right?
I think that's it.
And this is the high. Well, this is to me is the highlight. Is that you're a member of the Royal Historical Society? That's like getting preferred parking every day at home.
Yeah, doesn't do anything for me here in Arkansas.
No, well, it does a lot here. I'm impressed by it. So that means when I see you, because you're a member of the Royal Historical, do I have to bow? Do I have to genuflect?
You can. Okay. You can, or you can just give me a drink next time you see me.
That'd
be fine.
Yeah, done. Sir Erik.
So my writing, I've kind of got an ADHD approach to how I do things. You can see from my my books and even my articles, which I've got, I feel like I have most of my articles listed on my website that I've done. I try to keep up with them. It's kind of all over the board. I started out, as you can tell from my 2001, when I was 16 years old, article about Doc Holliday. I was really focused on the Earps and Tombstone, and that's kind of how I got my feet in the door, as it were, with, being mentored by certain historians and kind of learning, the context of Western history and Western expansion. But then I developed more broad interests in things. And then when I set my sights on something, I have a hard time letting it go. An example being you mentioned Sickness of the Heart. That's kind of like a modern tour guide to the subtitle of that is Along the Route of Conquest as Told by the Participants. So that was released on the 500th anniversary of the conquest of Mexico by Hernan Cortez. So that obviously has nothing to do with what we perceive to be as Western history. But that's a good example of something that I couldn't let go in my mind, and had to pursue as a project.
But that's but when I interviewed Chuck Parsons last week, we were talking about how he ends up getting onto a subject or a person or a place because he's usually writing another book, and then out pops this other piece, and he puts it to the side, and he says, I've got to finish the book, and then I've got to go back to this other piece. Is that kind of the same thing with you?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of times that's a blessing. And so you consider the book Main Street Mayhem, which is a book about the crime and violence in kind of the downtown area of the small town I live in Arkansas now. And you may think, well, Northeast Arkansas, that's not the Wild West. And that's true. But if a studious historian digs enough, they're going to find enough material to fill a book with shootings and fights and all this. And that's what I did with this book. But out of that book emerged a really interesting story about a guy, a local fellow who in 1909 killed somebody here, and long story short, fled to Australia. But before he did so, he was arrested in San Francisco before being brought back to Paragould. And the person who arrested him was a real long-time, tough detective in San Francisco named Arthur McQuaid. And so I guess like Chuck Parsons, I start looking at this Arthur McQuaid fella, and now I'm like, well, now I'm collecting all this material on Arthur McQuaid. And so out came the book Policing the Underworld, because I felt, nobody's ever heard of Arthur McQuaid. But there's so much stuff here, and this guy's got an amazing story to tell. And very similar, I've done a lot of work on an Irish gunman that not many people have heard of, but he's become a little more mainstream, named James Levy. He was involved in some water rights claims in Tombstone with the Earps. He was up in Deadwood. He was in Cheyenne. He was in Nevada. He was everywhere. He was a violent character. And in June of '82, he was killed in Tucson by a trio of gamblers. And so I started tracing who those gamblers were. And out came that Gamblers, Guns, and Gavels book. And from that, if people can follow what I'm saying here, emerged the Phil Foote book, because one of those gamblers was killed by Phil Foote later on in 1905, I believe, in Nevada. So you kind of just leapfrog these stories and you hope that it kind of just continues. But every once in a while you reach a dead end and you have to find a new project.
Well, let's talk about a project that you're on, because I'm curious. You're the associate editor, is that correct, of the Tombstone Epitaph?
Assistant, yeah.
Assistant editor. How did you end up on the Epitaph as an assistant editor?
Well, for several years I had been contributing articles to the Epitaph under its old editor. And in, I don't want to misspeak, but I think it was maybe 2018, 17, somewhere in there. Mark Boardman would be able to give a more correct answer. Mark Boardman, fine historian, who is the editor, took over the Epitaph. And in the midst of that kind of transition, Mark contacted me and asked if I'd be interested in joining him as his second. And I thought, well, what person's going to say no to this? You know, that's not only is that an amazing opportunity, but it's amazing leap forward in one's, you know, career as a historian. And I've been working with Mark ever since.
So what is your role, though? I mean, do you oversee articles? Do you, obviously, I know you also write out your own. What is your role there?
Right. So I think it's a lot more simplistic than what people think. I think a lot of folks still think that the Epitaph is produced, like Mark and I work out of the Epitaph office there in Tombstone, which
I actually thought that very thing, because one time I showed up at the Epitaph in the beginning of my interviews and podcasts, and was like, "Where's Mark?" And she's like, "He's in Indiana." I'm like, what? Yeah.
I can assure you, if I had an office at the Epitaph, I wouldn't be getting much done because I'd be down at the Crystal Palace all the time. But we get articles. I'll give you just how basically in a nutshell a month's thing comes together. We get articles submitted to us from various writers from across the world. They get placed physically like any newspaper does, and I don't like to use the term newspaper for the Epitaph, but it's like a magazine just on newspaper print, okay, or newspaper paper. So it gets constructed in that way. I coordinate usually months ahead of time with various authors for the author interviews. And that can be challenging at times because you have to plan ahead for interviewing this author or that author for this book coming out, and trying to coordinate when their book is launching and trying to time that in an appropriate manner. And I do a majority of the book reviews and the Yester West section, which is basically this day in, you know, each month, you know, be like August 1st, 1855, such and such happened. Mm-hmm. So we researched that. And when everything's more or less compiled by our compiler person, Melinda there in Safford, Arizona, it gets kicked back to all of us. We go through it with a fine-tooth comb digitally, mm-hmm. and we edit, suggest changes, etc. And we kick it back, make sure everything's hunky-dory. It gets kicked back one more time just to make sure everything's good to go before print, and then that's it. It's actually a pretty simple process. And we've been doing it for enough years now to where we've got a rhythm to it.
And then not only are you doing this work on the Epitaph, but I see you popping up into True West magazine. Are you involved in that from a editor, associate editor, contributor standpoint? So
True West, you know, I'll always have loyalty for True West because they were the first ones to take a gamble on me when I was 16 years old and a high school student. And somewhere around here, I have a letter from Bob Bosbell that was very encouraging to me and was saying something to the effect of, when I was your age, I wanted to do this, and now I own the magazine. So be careful what you wish for. And since that time, Bob and I have maintained a friendship, and now Stuart Rosebrook, who's the editor, the executive editor of the magazine, I work closely with him on submitting book reviews, much like I do with the Epitaph, and they were kind enough a year or two ago to name me a contributing editor of the magazine. And I think that's more or less a title, but more so placed in faith in my abilities within the field.
Well, Bob is huge for me. I mean, he said yes to an interview that he didn't know anybody about. Then he said yes to a second one. And now we're doing history bits, which are little mini stories that are taken out of True West magazine. He allowed me to take those little articles out that he wrote and do them as a podcast. And we do advertising, but the big thing is that he's just like, I don't know if he sees talent or if he's got something in him that says, I think this person's a winner, because I'm very flattered that he answers my emails and takes my phone calls. If I were you, it would be, even if you think it's like the associate editor or contributing editor, it's still something that Bob has opened up his arms and said, you're part of the True West family. I consider it an honor.
Yeah, and I don't take that lightly. It's no. Bob, I feel like is a lot like me in that, we're very. I don't have much of a filter when it comes to some things, and I feel like Bob is very much the same way. But we're also realists. I'm all for getting people engaged in history by whatever means. So, for example, you'll have people that will just critique every little thing out of something, be it a movie or a documentary or something, and they'll say, well, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right. Okay, well, that may be true, but let's look at the bigger picture. And I'll use the movie Tombstone as an example. So whatever inaccuracies were in the movie Tombstone, I think are irrelevant, because Tombstone set a new standard for bringing in just so many new historians into the field that without that movie, we wouldn't have the information we had today. So that's my argument, is regardless of the misinformation that's presented in a magazine article or a Wikipedia entry or a documentary or a comic book, if that serves as a gateway for someone to become interested and to start doing their own research, I think it's done its job. And people may disagree with me on that, but that's always been my point of view.
Well, I agree to that to some extent. The only worry I have with content that, even if it's misinterpreted or wrong, is then Facebook and people share it, and then it becomes in their mind gospel. Like they don't read any deeper into, like, when I see something, I'll look at it and I'll be like, I need to read about that, and I'll write it down on a notepad and I'll go read about it. And I think some people aren't like that, and they take it on Facebook and then they see it and then they pass it off, and before you know it, it's out there and you can't stop it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's something I've toyed with the idea of trying to develop a paper on, is the effect of Facebook or social media influence on our perception or understanding of Western history. Because anybody can put anything or any interpretation online. And it begs the question, it's like, so if I'm going to put XYZ on Facebook and 99% of the population is going to believe it and walk away from it at that point, what is the point of what we as legitimate historians are doing? Are we writing for ourselves? Are we writing for our peers? Or are we writing to help further information that is somehow, for some reason, not getting out to the general public?
Well, I think it's a combination of all three. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of writers and historians, and I think, and I could be wrong, it originally starts out with them thinking to themselves that I've got something here and I really want to dig deeper into it, and I want to fuel my thirst for finding out the truth, right? But then as the book begins to evolve and you're getting down to the end, then I think, from talking to many of them, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you get down to the end and now you're like, I can't wait to share this with the world. Like, I think that there's the original part of it, and then then the ending comes and you can't wait to see it in a finished book on a shelf and people buying it and enjoying it and reading it.
Yeah, you're right, and I think any historian that says otherwise is lying. But I think everybody likes to see their stuff in print, and likes to see that horrendous amount of work and research be finished. But and I don't know if there's others out there like me, but once something of mine is in print, be it in a magazine or a journal or a book, most of the time it then gets put on a shelf and I don't revisit it. So, for example, if you were to ask me details about the life and times of Arthur McQuaid today, that book came out in 2018, I really wouldn't be able to talk about it, because I now see that chapter closed. And I'm very critical of my own stuff. I guess a lot the way actors are with their movies. You often hear actors saying, "Oh, I've never seen that movie of mine." Once something of mine publishes, I'm not going to read it.
Well, I know that for a 100% fact, because every person that I reach out to, I'll say, I'd love to do a podcast or an interview about a book. And unless it's like John, when John's book came out about Pearl Hart, it had just come out, so he knew the content, he knew everything perfectly well, and blah, blah, blah. We were going to do a podcast about a previous book, and he's like, holy crap, I got to go back and read it. Like, I haven't even thought about it. And every researcher has been the same. Chuck, when we did Chuck's, he had to go back and just like his Kingfisher book, and he had to go back into it and reread some stuff and refamiliarize himself with Kingfisher. We're getting ready to interview Roy B. Young on the Pete Spence book. He hadn't thought about Pete Spence in a long time, and yet I keep it next to my bed as one of my go-to questions, you know what I mean? Because I live in Pete Spence world. Like, a lot of what he did and traveled is right around me or within an hour around me. So I know that for a fact, what you're saying, that once your book is completed and done, it's almost forgotten because you're on to the next project.
Well, I think part of the problem too is, and I can't speak for others, writing styles or methods. Mine is generally, let's say I have a project on whatever, right now I'm really focused on, the Overland Trail histories. And so I'll sit there and I'll gather material and I'll let it fester in my mind, so it'll sit and I'll think about it and I'll toy around with ideas kind of silently for months. And then all of a sudden, like some kind of big bang, it just comes out of me, very quickly. Just a couple weekends ago, I hammered out 4 papers, like WWHA style papers in a weekend. And that kind of explosive, kind of mental, work takes so much out of a person. Once you're done, you're done. And then I'm done for a couple months. That's probably not the healthiest approach to writing, is to do these kind of sporadic, spastic writing events. But I feel like once I research and kind of think about things for so long, then my mind boils over, and then I just have to get it out, and then I'm done with it, and then I'm done with it. And then I can put it away. So I don't know if that helps get in the mind of someone like me, but used to, when I was younger, I would spend half my time emailing various historian friends of mine saying, well, what would you do in this situation? Or how would you handle this? Or how do you research that? Or how would you write this? And now, I've got a pretty good foothold on it, I think. And thanks to them, it's kind of become less of a hobby and more of a career.
Do you have a new book that you're working on now?
I get that question every once in a while. No, I've got things that I'm compiling for various projects. One is collecting stories from people who knew my dad when he worked in the geophysics field, and kind of mirroring those stories with experiences of my own when I worked for some of the same companies out west, anecdotal type stuff. And I'm compiling a lot of stuff on the Oregon and California trails, but I'm not quite sure where that's going yet. Mm-hmm. I've got a real interest in violence on the Oregon and California trails. But some of that material is hard to nail down. So right. I'm not sure if something's going to come from it or not.
Well, if you are wondering who we're talking to, we're speaking to Erik J. Wright. He is a researcher, historian. He's an assistant editor with the Tombstone Epitaph. He's involved with True West Magazine, as well as writing his own books. If you want to find Erik J. Wright, you can go to Amazon and actually type in the words Erik, and it's E-R-I-K, not a C, but E-R-I-K, J, the letter J, Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. And if you go onto Amazon, all his books will be shown. Do you have a website, or is it just Amazon the best way?
Yeah, I have a website. It's just all spelled out, ErikWrightHistorian.com. ErikWrightHistorian.com. All right. Can we purchase books there too? There's not like a shopping cart, but there's a way to contact me. And if anyone wants to contact me directly and request something specific, I can get it out to you and sign it. Or even if they want a copy of a specific article, if they're researching something, I can try to dig some up and send it to you. Awesome.
Again, this is Erik Wright, and you can find all his books on Amazon, or you can go to his website at ErikWrightHistorian.com. I got about 20 minutes left. That's how fast it goes. You've written a lot of books, and you've done a lot of things. And I asked this question of Chuck Parsons, and he kind of gave me a funny answer, which was, I'm going to ask you, like, of all the books that you've written here, was there one that stood out that was either most revealing, or that it was, oh my God, I can't even believe that I found this, or whatever, that this book really rocked you or became your favorite? Chuck said, that's like asking me which child is my favorite. And I said, well, true, but there's got to be one out of your, because you have a decent library that you've created of history books that you've written. Is there one that stands out?
Well, I'm really proud of and while I'm proud of it, I'm equally wishing I would have done better on it. The Phil Foote book, was pure grassroots research. I mean, I pulled Phil Foote out of the woodpile and just completely reinvigorated his story. I mean, before I did something on Phil, and I am not the type to toot my horn, but I dare say before, I did anything on Phil Foote, nobody had heard about Phil Foote. But I think there was an opportunity there to reinvigorate his story a little bit more. And luckily, I don't want to give too much away, but there is a project that I'm working on with Phil Foote in the English Westerner Society for hopefully next year. The other one, it's not my book, but I had a contribution, and that's my contribution of the Tom Mulqueen article in the Wyatt Earp anthology that was edited by Roy Young from the University of North Texas Press. And I think that's less because my work was in it and more because I'm really big into the fact that I was, one, kind of brought into the field at the end of the Boyer era, and two, that, these guys who took me under their wing, this was kind of the closing of a chapter, as it were, that they're like, look, Erik has paid his dues. He's done his due diligence. Now let's include him in this kind of capstone book. So that one means a lot to me.
So let's talk about anthology, because it is such a profound book. And if anybody's wondering, and Erik can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it is the book, on Wyatt Earp. There's the other stuff that's out there by Stuart Lake and stuff, and the other writers before and that way before us that have written phenomenal stories. But I think in terms of Wyatt Earp and putting a complete history anthology together, it is the book. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. And there's, as anybody knows, there's been a lot done on Earp and Earp era tombstone and everything in between. In this book, it's a big book. It includes everything you would ever want to know about Wyatt Earp by everyone who has done something on Wyatt Earp that is worth their weight in the field. So we're talking, Casey and John and Peter Brand and Roy and Jeff Morey. And, I don't have the book in front of me, but yeah. I mean, just everybody. And I'm surprised, to be honest with you, that something like this hadn't been done a long time ago. Because a lot of this stuff was out there, in this location or that location. And most of us historians kind of had the material and files, but it was not consolidated in one kind of handsome presentation that UNT Press put together. And to have that for the sake of posterity alone, I think is really nice. But, it's interesting how, I'm a sentimental person, but it's interesting to me how a guy like Wyatt Earp, who I'm not either pro or con Wyatt Earp, I'm just, can bring people together like that. And it's the same with anybody, Billy the Kid or Custer or anything like that. But it's amazing to me how that works.
So did you get a phone call from Roy or an email that said, hey, we'd love you to be part of Anthology? And when you got that, did you jump up and down and go, holy crap, I've hit the mother lode?
Well, I think I got what had happened was my paper on Tom Mulqueen. Tom Mulqueen was like kind of a known gambler and horse racing kind of aficionado there in San Francisco at the time. Wyatt Earp lived there, and Tom Mulqueen knocked out Wyatt Earp in a San Francisco saloon. And I wrote about that. And then I connected the story to Casey because in a very roundabout way, Tom Mulqueen attended a wedding at a church that Casey's grandfather, I believe it was his grandfather, constructed the archway to. And so I thought that was really interesting, and Casey provided me some pictures for that. And I think Casey was really, both Casey and Gary Roberts were really intrigued by the article. They thought it was really well done. And it was Casey that contacted me asking, if they could use the paper for the book. And, I'm not going to say no. And so that was basically it. And the first time I saw the copy was at the WWHA Roundup in Cheyenne back in 2019.
That's crazy. I can't even imagine to see, an article I wrote or something in like a book like anthology, because it's so, it's almost groundbreaking, even though the history behind it, because it's all unearthed and it's true research. You're past the Boyer years, it's just, and you've got these wonderful people like Casey and Roy and Gary and you, and I think Pam Potter's, there's just so many people. So
what's really important for me is, you talk about the post-Boyer years, and I think people kind of realize, they're like, hey, the past however many decades have been really screwed up. And then they see this young, eager kid coming along, and there were several folks who really took closely to me. Peter, the late Paul Kuhl, the late Mark Dworkin, Roy, John. It's just, I couldn't have been put in a better position to be mentored by some of these people. And I regret every day that people like Mark Dworkin and Paul Kuhl are no longer with us. And I even have a picture of Paul in my home office kind of looking over me, so that when I'm writing, it's, I have this mantra of, what would Paul do? Mm-hmm. Usually it's not what I'm doing at the time. So I have to stop and reevaluate and think, all right, Paul was a very level-headed, easygoing guy, and I'm usually the opposite. And I just, if it weren't for those people, embracing me and showing me the right path after the field had been so far off in the left field, I don't think I'd be where I am today.
Well, listen, we got just a few minutes, so I'll give you 5 minutes on this next one. 5 minutes, that's it. I'll have to cut you off. Where do you think we are, because it makes me think about this, where do you think we are in the future of Western, Old West, Wild West history? And hear me out. People like you, James Mill just wrote, and the new Billy the Kid book is out. I can't even say it right. El Bendito Simpatico. The new Billy, I probably butchered that. I'm sorry if I did. But the new James B. Mills. You've got Samuel Kilborn, who just wrote El Paso, another phenomenal writer. You've got yourself. You've got, shout out to Donna Harrell, even though she hasn't written anything. She's got, phenomenal history on the Youngers that we're doing in podcasts, and I think she's written some articles. But we have the future emerging. Where do you think we are with that?
I think it's easy to get pessimistic about the state of where the field is going, because you go to and no offense to the older crowd, please, but you go to some of these conferences and it's a sea of white hair. That's not exclusive to WWHA. You know, I belong to the Oregon California Trails Association. A lot of those, everything, it's all older crowds. But I think the more that people like James and Sam and I do, by making history engaging. Okay, we talk about, and I'm sorry you have to do this, but I mean, you have to talk about stuff that's exciting too. You know, people, I remember there was something that was done at one of the historical societies in Arizona, and it was like an exhibit about quilts or something. And, you know, I'm sorry if you like quilts, but that's not going to get me engaged. Mm-hmm. You know, you have to get people hooked. And it starts in school, or it starts with your parents. And, you know, there are folks out there like us, younger people, that are doing this. And you bring up Sam. I've brought this up to him before. Sam, if you're listening, when are we going to collaborate on something?
Right.
I don't want to have to come up to Montana and twist your arm, but Sam is a good guy. Mm-hmm. And he's a very smart historian, and I think he's the next John Bosenecker. Anyways, yeah, just support your historian. If they're old, if they're young, I don't care. That's the way we can move the field forward. Recognize the right sources, buy our books, read our articles, and hold us up. You know, legitimize our work. That's how we can move it forward.
You got 2 minutes. Tell me something about Erik that only Erik and family would know. For example, we talked to Chuck last weekend, and Chuck said, I love mushrooms, deep fried mushrooms, and ranch dressing. What is Erik? It doesn't have to be a food thing. It could be something you do at home. What is something that only you and the family know that you love?
I live to tease my kids. Okay. I like anchovies on my pizza. I like Tabasco in my beer. And just about a year ago, I was on my trip that was tracing the Transcontinental Railroad and Oregon Trail across Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah. And I'm getting very, very anxious to do that trip again. You know, I sit here in my emergency management office here in Arkansas and look out the window and think, yeah, I'd rather be out on the high plains. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But
so Tabasco in your beer.
Tabasco in the beer.
And I don't even know what the other one was. It was disgusting.
Anchovies on
your pizza. We're not having pizza together. I'll do the hot sauce on the beer. That actually sounds pretty good. So we are talking to Erik Wright. You can find Erik at ericwrighthistorian.com, and that's Erik, E-R-I-K. Wright is W-R-I-G-H-T. So ericwrighthistorian.com. You can also get his books on Amazon. And Amazon's another one to pick up, and he's got a bunch of them. If you subscribe to the Tombstone Epitaph, you'll actually find on the very last page, it's always there on the right-hand corner. I'm looking at it right now, a list of his books with an order coupon. You want to get the books there. Of course, if you're going to be at the Epitaph, you might as well subscribe. 3 years for $60 or 1 year for $25, and there's an in-between price. But again, the 3 years is fantastic. I want to thank Bob Bosebell, as much as I'm sure Erik does, Bob Bosebell over at True West Magazine. If you want to become a subscriber or a maniac like I am, you can go and do that at truewestmagazine.com. And of course, our friends over at the WWHA Wild West History Association. We just came back from Roundup 2022, was at Rapid City, South Dakota. We went to Deadwood, Rushmore. It was a phenomenal trip. My wife and I had the best time, and 2023 is going to be at the Alamo in Texas, and I'm hoping we can see you there. But if you want to join that, you can join the WWHA at wildwesthistory.org. The price is about $75. Some people will say that's kind of high, but I don't, because you get the journal delivered right to your door. And it's 100 plus pages. You're getting a book. You're getting a 100-page book delivered to your door on a quarterly basis. And that alone is worth the cost, and it's fantastic. And I keep all of them, and I really urge you to join the WWHA and the Wild West History Association. Got anything else, bud? Anything else we need to cover?
No, sir. I just encourage everyone to, like I said, support their historians, subscribe to those things. That helps us. Buy their books. That helps us. Give us shout outs, reviews, everything they can do. And I appreciate you, Mike.
Yeah, man. So you can find, and I appreciate you. You can find my podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio app. Make sure you give me a rating and review if you can. It helps distribution. And if you're over on YouTube and you like your audio podcast on YouTube, and you're visually impaired, maybe reading a book is a little difficult, let some folks know that are out there that, hey, there's podcasts that are nothing but Western history. And you can find me on YouTube at Cochise County _travels, or you can type in the words Wild West under your search bar, and I'll come up with all the Wild West Wild West podcast. And my podcast is really dedicated directly to the historian, the researcher, and the writer that brings those stories, and we talk about those stories, and we got a bunch planned. So if you're on YouTube, you can find me there at Cochise County _travels. Hit the subscribe button, set the notification bell, because I am loading podcasts. I just loaded the Chuck Parsons Kingfisher podcast yesterday. So that is out on YouTube, and it's ready to listen. As always, we appreciate you guys.